What's up, Genshin YouTube? This is Bench Gamer. Today I want to talk a bit about the idea of a Genshin killer. This idea has been thrown around a lot in the Genshin Impact community these days, especially by the Genshin content creators themselves. So Genshin is not a new game anymore, and it's nearing its 2-year anniversary, believe it or not. In games industry terms, that's basically forever, and like most games, maybe more so than others, Genshin has run low on content. This is not entirely Genshin's fault itself, nor Hoyoverse's. If you look at any of her talks about how their game works and what the focus of their content is, it's pretty obvious that Genshin is meant to be an easy and casual game, more of a slice of life waifu collector than a serious competitive RPG with repeatable endgame objectives. The problem with that is that many content creators, as well as hardcore players, have basically made it their life's job to play Genshin on a daily basis. That's how they make their money, that's what they enjoy. Or not, but they have to make money anyways. Before Inazuma, I think there was a good deal of hope that at some point Hoyoverse would decide to add in the mythical endgame content that we've all been talking about. But as time went on, I think that hope has slowly disappeared and basically just evaporated. At this point, I don't think anybody realistically expects there to be any major changes to how Genshin does its content. It is what it is. At the same time, other cracks in how Genshin content is handled have become more apparent. The way Hoyoverse has handled Yai's release, for example, and to a lesser extent, Yoimiya. Hoyoverse seems to be very bent on not changing anything about a character post-release, even if they are deemed to be broken, unfinished, or just not fun. And even parts of the slice of life gameplay, like the Serenity Pot realm building, have been put on hold due to indefinite maintenance. This is probably because of the current COVID lockdown in Shanghai, where the Hoyoverse is located. I don't know if this is true, I'm just putting two and two together. It could be a bug, it could be something else, but it makes sense to me that they wouldn't be able to do server maintenance without access to the on-site equipment. Or it could be something else entirely, and I'm just completely wrong. So, and as these flaws have become more apparent while content has run out, it's easy to see why people would want a Genshin Impact killer. So when we're talking about a Genshin killer, we have to keep in mind that what we're actually talking about is a Genshin Impact Plus, a Genshin with endgame content that it currently does not have, a Genshin that has a developer that takes into consideration some of the criticisms of its player base and implements some of those changes for characters like Yai, a Genshin that perhaps updates the game more frequently with content relevant to the core gameplay instead of minigames and picture-taking events, which, to be honest, sometimes I enjoy, but, most people probably don't. These are just some of the things people probably think about when they say Genshin killer. What they want is a game that feels like how Genshin did when they first discovered it, and more. The situation reminds me a bit of when WoW was first released, but as I got older, especially after the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, people just started getting bored and hoping for another MMO to take its place. The dynamics behind that have been covered to a far greater extent elsewhere, so I won't get into that, but I feel like this is kind of the same situation. We have a hugely successful game that had a very good launch, but has in some ways failed to live up to some of the expectations set by its player base. So now some of them are hoping for something else to take its place, but like WoW, I don't believe this will ever realistically happen, which isn't a bad thing. More than one game of the same genre can exist at the same time. Final Fantasy XIV didn't so much beat WoW so much as Blizzard just caused WoW to fail, and frankly, nobody with a life gives a shit that Final Fantasy XIV overtook WoW's player base like 20 years after release. That just speaks to WoW's age and longevity, so as well as Blizzard's own fuck-ups more than anything Final Fantasy XIV did. Which isn't to say that FF14 didn't do well, so please don't fucking cancel me, Final Fantasy XIV fans. I like Final Fantasy XIV, I just don't think it did anything that differently from WoW to be, to warrant being called a WoW killer. And much like WoW, I don't think anything will ever really kill Genshin unless it's some major screw-up on Hoyoverse's end. And no, the lack of endgame content in Genshin does not constitute a major screw-up. Genshin content creators are not the end-all be-all of Genshin's audience, and nor are the hardcore players who only care about meta and combat, even though that is admittedly the vast majority of the game. Hoyoverse has the statistics and numbers that will tell them what is the most optimal way to increase and retain players. If they honestly believe that endgame content would make the game more popular, then they would have done that by now. This isn't an attack on players who do want that content, since I am one of them, but it is the most logical explanation given that Hoyoverse is a multi-billion-dollar company and almost definitely have a bunch of analysts going over the numbers to maximize profit. For example, Iato is earning megabucks in Japan right now. It's literally the most profitable banner of all time there. and no amount of whinging from me or anybody else can do anything about it. Basically, whatever Hoyoverse is already doing now is what they consider to be the most optimal way of earning the most money, and that includes doing absolutely fucking nothing about Yai. So make of that what you will. So it's no surprise that people who have gone into Genshin Impact but no longer like the way it's developing want to try something else, if only because they've already finished all the content and have nothing to do anymore, or they're just bored of the whole thing. That's perfectly valid as well, and I don't think any of them realistically expect another game to literally kill Genshin Impact. If anybody actually thinks that, then I want whatever Copium they're on, because it's definitely stronger than whatever I've had. What they're probably hoping for, though, is a Genshin-like game, but just leaning more towards the content they actually do like the combat. The problem with that, though, is that many of the games that have recently been revealed are not Genshin-likes in any meaningful way beyond their aesthetic, nor are the chances of them killing Genshin, or even succeeding in some cases, really warranted. Games like Tower Fantasy and Seven Deadly Sins Origins are made by and published by companies which are either untested with no real great breakout hit under the belts, or have had histories of failing to support their own games. Basically, the companies that are pushing for the creation of these Genshin-likes are often themselves worse than Hoyoverse. And even ignoring the history of these developers and companies, there's no guarantee that a game with similar content to Genshin will succeed in the same way. Genshin released at a time when the vast majority of game companies actually received the boost in player base and revenue due to COVID. Genshin was also the first game to have a fully 3D open world that's like Breath of the Wild, while also tapping into the anime waifu collecting gacha genre. For a similar game to have the same level of success, it would not only have to have the same thing, but better, it would also have to have more of it as well, because people are going to be more invested in Genshin than a new game. Early adopter advantage is very real, and that's basically why no MMO could ever match up to WoW for more than a decade. By the time those games came out, WoW had already left them far behind in terms of the amount of content it had. Genshin is a bit different because the vast majority of its content is not repeatable, but consider that even when it first launched, Hoyoverse had already spent over $100 million to develop the game, and at that point it only had Mondstadt and Liyue. Now imagine the amount of time and effort that would have to go into a legitimate Genshin competitor to have that same amount of content, which would most likely end up earning less anyways, because the same environment that Genshin released in no longer exists. Another problem these Genshin-likes face is that they will be compared to Genshin, and despite Genshin's problems, which we like to complain about non-stop, it does do some things incredibly well. The way it markets its characters and the hype they create, the setting and mystery around the lore, the stylistic uniqueness of the art, even the combat, which, while not the most complex, let's be honest, is still very addictive, and one of the main reasons we even play the game in the first place. So while it's fun and like really therapeutic to criticize Genshin every once in a while, there's a reason why we're all playing it in the first place. And there's no guarantee that Genshin competitors will compare favorably in all these aspects. Some of the games like Tower Fantasy are not even like in the same genre completely, since they're MMOs, and will have additional problems that Genshin doesn't face, like how to balance PvP when you have whales and free-to-play players in the same game. And just the nature of MMOs having more than one or a few players in the same environment will have additional issues that Genshin doesn't have to the same extent, like lag and connection problems, which will be even more apparent. There's also the fact that Tower Fantasy has already released in China a few months ago, and it has absolutely failed to be anywhere close to a Genshin killer. In fact, it's being plagued with accusations like plagiarizing work, stealing cutscenes and assets from Honkai Impact, which is another Hoyoverse game, and copy-pasting reviews from Genshin onto their own game. So apparently the devs also marketed the same game, their game, unironically as a Genshin killer. So this isn't just me saying it's a Genshin killer. They literally called their own game a Genshin killer, which is pretty embarrassing if you ask me. They're still working on the game, and there's a 2.0 patch slated for release sometime in the future, but as far as I know, we'll just be getting the first version for global launch, which is disappointing to say the least. Another great thing about Genshin that sets it apart from many other gachas, especially the Japanese ones, is that it does do global launches. So barring time zone differences, it's pretty much a simultaneous launch in all regions. So it's disappointing that we won't be getting the same for Tower Fantasy, and when we do get it, it'll be like already old news for the China audience. Another advantage Genshin has that I don't see getting talked about a lot is that it is an original IP, so everything about it is basically whatever Hoyoverse wants it to be. Whereas you have other IPs like Seven Deadly Sins that just don't have nearly as many memorable characters to draw from as Genshin. There is only a finite pool of characters to draw from, and they have less creative room to make new ones as well. And even if they do create new ones, it's not like the players for that game will care as much about them as the canon characters, because they're just things made up, probably not even by the same author. So Hoyoverse can just make shit up as they go and make each new character as interesting as the other ones, at least in theory. Seven Deadly Sins is based on a specific story in the original manga that has its own share of problems. Maybe my bias is showing a bit because I am a big fan of the manga and anime, and I was very disappointed with the second half of the story. So this is going to like make no sense to people who haven't watched anime or manga, but after the Demon Form Meliodas versus Escanor fight, everything started going downhill with battles and plot points making absolutely no fucking sense whatsoever. It just felt very lazy. In fact, the last season of the anime was just completely fucked. It got contracted out to some random animation studio that made Dragon Ball Super look like a fucking Ghibli film. If I were to compare Seven Deadly Sins story to the Inazuma chapter, Inazuma would be like a 7 out of 10, and Seven Deadly Sins would be like a 4 or 5. Characters that actually did things in the first half of the story got the TN treatment in the second half, which is to say they got no treatment. They just did fucking nothing. They just didn't matter anymore, and I'm not sure how they'll be able to make the gacha side of the things work for that game when only a select few characters are just so much more popular than others. It's not like Genshin Impact where, you know, all of the characters are even the most unliked character like Xingyan still has their own fans, but I don't know if there are fans for some of the characters in Seven Deadly Sins. Maybe this is a complete non-issue because there is already a previous Seven Deadly Sins gacha game, and that seems to be reviewing pretty well, so I don't know. Another small worry I have with the game is how good it looks, which sounds wrong because it's good for a game to look good, right? But when I first saw Genshin, my first reaction was that it was the next level of the aesthetic that Breath of the Wild has created without being held down by the Switch. To me, what the trailer for Seven Deadly Sins Origins shows is basically what I imagine to be the next evolution of the Genshin aesthetic. But how the fuck is this going to run on a phone? Genshin is by no means like the greatest looking game of all time, at least technically speaking, nor is it the most well optimized one either. It barely runs my P30 Pro, and even on my PC, it still frequently stutters and sometimes just freezes for no reason for a few seconds. Maybe I'm being too cynical, but the whole trailer for this game is giving me off a bit of that pre-rendered vibe. If this game turned out to be for PC and console only, I would not be surprised at all. In fact, I would probably prefer it to being just PC and console only to being a mobile game, because I don't want to deal with bullshit like data limits holding back the game like it does with Genshin. But then it wouldn't be competing with Genshin 101 either, right? Because then it's not a mobile game anymore, and it won't have the same audience. It's also going to be published by Netmarble, so if you know anything about Netmarble, maybe just make of that what you will. I just hope the whole thing isn't vaporware. That's basically all I'm saying. Aside from Origins and Tower Fantasy, there's also this other game called Arknight's Endfield. So this is a game that is set in an already established IP. Arknights is a very successful gacha tower defense game, and it was actually my first gacha game prior to playing Genshin Impact. In fact, it was probably my gateway drug into Genshin, and I probably wouldn't have gone into Genshin without Arknights in the first place. So I'm pretty hyped for a potential Genshin-like Arknights game. The trailer does a good job of showing what an Arknight's aesthetic might look like if it was translated into a 3D environment like Genshin, and that's basically all it does. There's very little to no gameplay shown, and the only thing we know about it is that you can run around a corridor and you can climb onto some platforms. That you do that because you avoid a wave-like attack on the ground. It doesn't look like it'll be an open world game similar to Genshin either, because one, it doesn't market itself as one. And two, the climbing animations seem pretty specific to these platform environmental objects. So you can even see the player run into a fence, and they just stop at the fence without climbing. So it seems like it's a hard wall instead of something you can just climb over like in Genshin. I don't think you can even jump in this game yet, because otherwise, why would you climb onto the objects instead of just jumping over the wave attacks from the tower? To be honest, I don't think they even have the basic gameplay elements figured out yet, and most of them are either just not there or not figured out. What this trailer does show off are the 3D assets, so that you can build hype and prepare for the theoretical audience in 2 to 3 years down the line, and maybe get some investors and funding as well. but I don't expect it to be a real game until at least late 2023 at the earliest. And by that time, Genshin will already be moving on to Natlands, so it's way too early to tell if this will be a Genshin killer, quote unquote, or if it'll just be like any other game. It'll just be a game that looks like Genshin and evokes that Genshin feel, but I don't think it's going to play anything like Genshin. We just don't know enough. And when it does come out, Genshin will probably be around halfway through its main story anyways, so at that point, whoever is still playing Genshin is going to keep playing Genshin realistically, barring some sort of extreme fuck up by MiHoYoverse. I don't think anything I just said isn't already obvious to Genshin players or just people interested in the gacha genre in general, but I do wish there were alternatives to Genshin, or really any alternatives at all, so that HoYoverse keeps on their toes and don't get lazy, but it's going to be an uphill battle. And to be real, I don't think any of the games I just listed are going to be true one-to-one competitors with Genshin at all. And even these games that are being marketed or seen as Genshin killers don't have that much in common with the Genshin in reality besides their art style. And some of them look too good to be true, so that has me pretty skeptical about where they're headed. And some of their publishers and developers are kind of unknown or just have really bad histories in general. Or they won't come out anytime in the near future for them to really matter. Like Arknight's Enfield, I suspect, is coming out in late 2023. So that's after Fontaine. And we're probably going to be headed to like Natland sometime around that time. So there's no reason why they can't coexist either, which is what they most likely will do. And they won't just affect each other in any significant way whatsoever. It's not like I can't play Arknights and Genshin at the same time. It's not like an either or situation. It just won't be a Genshin killer specifically. What will most likely happen in the future is that HoYoverse itself will branch out and make other games closer in quality to Genshin. So we're still going to be playing HoYoverse games, just not Genshin. And we're already seeing that happen with Honkai Star Rail, and we know that they're also working on something using Unreal Engine 5. So hopefully that turns into a game that we can really dig deep into in the future. All in all, I think competition will be good for Genshin, and I'll definitely play these new games when they come out globally. But it's going to be, like, we need to keep some perspective in mind as well. Especially for those of you who are, like, burnt out or really unhappy where the game's direction is going. There are still reasons why Genshin is so popular that will be hard to replicate for any future games in the same genre. That doesn't mean they won't be fun or successful in their own right, but I doubt any of them will ever truly be a Genshin killer. Anyways, this is Bench Gamer signing out.